will introduce Helen Thom, who is a returning speaker to the BMSEDG. Helen, may that be your 5th or 6th talk now? I'm sure you'll correct me if that's wrong.
I think this is the 6th one now, yeah.
The 6th talk. So Helen's talks are always very well evaluated, always scored highly, always well attended. So I think we're going to have another good session this afternoon, and we're going to be having a look and having a little bit discussion of a laboratory perspective of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Helen, who'll introduce herself and the subject today, and we'll get started. So over to you, Helen.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us. I hope you find this session interesting. I have done this talk previously, so I've just slightly updated it for today. But if you've got any questions as we go along, please feel free to put your hand up. You don't have to wait till the end or anything like that. I'm happy to take a pause and go over stuff as well, because it is quite confusing, but I've tried to make it just something that's fun and interesting, and I hope you enjoy it. So hopefully you can see my screen. And firstly, so who lives in a papaya under the sea? Which you're probably thinking, what on earth is she talking about? Well, it's SpongeBob Allo-absorption pants. And SpongeBob's moved house, so he now lives in a papaya. It's not as good quality as the pineapple, but hopefully this will make sense as we go through the talk, and I hope you enjoy it. For those of you who are familiar with SpongeBob, so you know you're on mute unfortunately, but are you ready, kids? Aye, aye, Captain. Hopefully you're all enjoying this, and like I said, feel free to join in whenever you want. So what is autoimmune hemolytic anemia? So the definition, which I pinched from the BSH guidelines, are autoimmune hemolytic anemia. It's a decompensated acquired hemolysis caused by the host immune system acting against its own red cells. So essentially, it's your autoantibody is destroying your own red cells, and you may require transfusion support throughout. It's about 1 in 100,000 per year. You can get it at any age, but it's generally seen with increasing age. So the cases that we generally used to have when I went in the reference lab were with older patients. Serologically, there are 4 different types. So we've got the warm type, which is what I'm going to talk about today, and that's around 65%. We've got cold type, which is your CHAD, which is around 29%. Paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, I've been practicing that one, which is 1%, and then mixed, which is your warm and cold. But like I said, we're going to talk about the warm one today. From a transfusion lab point of view, we would just say you've got a pan-reactive autoantibody, and that's what you're going to see. And pan, when we talk about pan-reactive, we just mean that it's pan, it reacts with everything. So all of your panel cells will be positive, including the patient's autocontrol as well. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go through your patient history and why that's important. We're going to talk about antibody-antigen interactions, because you need to understand these in order to understand why we do alloabsorptions and how it works. How we're doing antibody ID from that, what blood selection would need for these patients, and then how we'd report the results, so what you see at the end of it. So hopefully it's a start to finish approach to what happens when you send the samples to the reference lab. So this should look familiar. So this is your RCI request form. And when we're asking for the patient history, it's just going through and making sure that you've filled in the form correctly. So we want the hospital and requester details. We need the patient demographics to make sure that it's the right patient, enter the information on all limbs, etc. This one's going to be sent for reference investigation. And as part of that, we'll perform an ABO, an extended RHK if required. We'll do an antibody ID and any phenotyping or genotyping that may need to be done with the results that you see. Whether it's a cross-match request or not. And really importantly, we need to know the clinical details. So what the diagnosis is, in this case, it's autoimmune hemolytic anemia, what the hemoglobin is, any transfusion history. And it's really important that we know this, because we need to know if the patient's been transfused within the last 3 months, because if they have, they may require an eluate to see if there's any antibodies hiding out of the way. And then whatever your findings are as well, because that can actually be really helpful. So your historical ABO, any DAT results you've got, and any historical antibodies, because in case the antibodies aren't detected in the current sample. So now we're going to look at antibody-antigen interactions. The way I was taught this is it's bucket chemistry. So it's a drop of plasma and a drop of red cells. You mix them together and you're going to get a reaction. What's actually happening here is you mix an unknown antibody with a known antigen. So you don't know what's in the plasma, but you mix it with the red cells. You know the profile of those red cells, and that'll give you perform your antibody ID, and it gives you an answer. The antibody, that's the unknown antibody in the plasma, will bind with its corresponding antigen on those red cells, and this is what gives you that positive result when you do your antibody ID. So you'd start off by doing your screen. So this is your unknown antibody with your known red cells, mix them together, incubate them at 37 degrees for 15 minutes. We're just going to take a little closer look at what's going on here. So when you're doing an antibody ID, so either your screens or your panels, you're actually performing an indirect antiglobulin test. So when you mix that unknown antibody with your known red cells, the antibody, because it's IgG that we're looking at, because this is warm, it can't bridge the gap. It can only sensitize the red cells. It can't actually stick them together and cause agglutination, whereas IgM can, because it's big. So you need something in the middle. So when you're looking at your cards, they might be green. Well, probably will be green. And that's because they're using a bridging antibody. And this is what's known as anti-human globulin. So what you do is you include this in your test. So you're indirectly binding the red cells together. When you centrifuge them, that's when you're going to get agglutination, and that's going to be your positive result. And then this is what it looks like. So go back to patient sample, unknown antibody, known antigen, binding antibody in the middle there, and if you get a positive result, they've all clumped together, and this is what it would look like on your card when you're performing your screen. And then I appreciate there's some people on this call who may have never performed a screen yet. We're aiming this a trainee, so if you've never set foot in a transfusion lab yet, this is what it would look like when you're recording your results. You take your positive one and you record the corresponding well with the corresponding cell on your sheet. So you'd record that result there, and that's a 2+, so write that down. And you've got a negative result there, you record that, and negative result there, and you record that. And you've got a positive screen. You may be able to, you would need to then do a panel to see what's going on. So when we talk about panels, the reason that we do antibody ID panels is so you can include your antibodies. So when you're testing, performing an antibody ID and you identify an antibody, you've got to have 2 positive examples and 2 negative examples of that single specificity to confirm the presence of it. Hopefully that makes sense. And just very quickly, your panel, it's made up of 8 or more groups, 8 or more cells from group O donors, because you don't want any ABO mismatches. They've got to cover your commonly encountered clinically significant antibodies, and 2 positives and 2 negatives, and that's because that's how many you need to confirm an antibody. One's got to be an R1, which is this big C pos, that Lee pos, and you've got to include a CW in amongst that as well. And between them, they've got to express these antigens here. So Kells, Duffy's, kids, and your S's. Then you've got to have at least 1 or 2 or dash little or double dash. Don't worry about all this. This is just me telling you. I'm not expecting everyone to know the RH phenotypes. And then you've got to have at least 3 examples of your O-neg cells, one of which has got to be K-pos, and also express the antigens, which you've got to have on your O-positives. When you're performing your antibody exclusions, so once you've identified your antibody, it's really important that you exclude any further clinically significant antibodies to make sure nothing's hiding. You don't want to miss antibodies when you're transfusing the patient. So once we've identified it, it's really important to exclude any more so that the patient doesn't have a transfusion reaction. And in particular, you've got your kids, your S's, and your Duffys have to be excluded. And it says here using homozygous expression. So what that means is a cell that's GK pos, GKB neg, for example. So we might call them like single dose and things. And you only need one of those. One of these phenotypes is sufficient for exclusion. And we've got Squidward here on the bottom having a transfusion reaction. So he has a feeling of impending doom, and he would probably roll off the bed if he was having a transfusion reaction. So one of the things that's important when you do antibody IDs, you'll use enzyme treated cells as well. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about packaging, just for those of you who don't know how this works. So you've got your antigens on your red cell. So I have Squidward here, and he's wanting to do some sunbathing. But unfortunately, the Duffy antigens and the M, N, and S's are in the way, so you can't get any sun. And this is the same way when if the sun was your antibody wanting to go and bind with its corresponding antigen, it can't really get to it because something's in the way. So papain comes along, so Patrick's going to come along and knock these trees down, and it moves them out of the way. So certain antigens are sensitive to papain, which are your Duffys and your M, N, and S's. Moves them out of the way, gets the sun. So what you'd see from an antibody ID point of view for this, the antibody can actually get a hold of the antigens that are left over. So you would actually see an enhanced reaction. So it tends to be a much stronger reaction by enzyme, but it's therefore not capable of detecting your Duffys and your M and S's. Try and say that. So hopefully everyone's all right at this point. I can't see any hands up or anything, and nothing going on in the chat, so I'm hoping this all makes sense for you. So I'm now going to go through how we do an antibody ID. So this is just a general bog standard. This is how you do your inclusions and your exclusions on a panel, just for those of you on the call who might never have seen this before. So how I do it, I start at the right hand side and I work my way along. So I would take my pen and I'd sort of move down this line here, and I'd go along, say, right, I'm looking at a JKB, so I go down the first positive example that I've got of it, and I move along, and it's I've got a score there, which means this could potentially mean that the corresponding antigen has found its antibody, has found its corresponding antigen. So I can't exclude it. So nothing, I've got to move on to the next one. Then I go down here to the JKB, go down to my next positive example, and I move along, and that's negative. So what that's showing there is if there's no anti-JKB here, because if there was, it would have found its corresponding antigen and there'd be a positive reaction. So I can take my pen and I can just cross that out and go, right, I've excluded that one. Following the guidelines, I can at this point exclude anti-JKB, but when you come from a reference background, you just like to have, well, personally, I like to have 2 exclusions. So I would continue on to the next one, go along, it's negative, and cross that one out, and that's anti-JKB gone. That's how I do an antibody ID. People might have other methods that you use, but I just generally tend to find this one. Sorry, I was just checking the chat there. So then I move on to JK, and I go down, next positive example, go along, I can exclude it. There you go, cross it out at the top, got me 2, I'm just reassured that I've doubly made sure that it's gone, and then so on and so forth. And I've just sped this up. I've already done the antibody IDs here, haven't crossed them all out because it takes a long time to do the animations, but it's just hopefully you can see how I would do an antibody ID. So then we'll get the final column here, so in anti-D. So I'm moving, if I move down to here, hopefully you can see my cursor, everybody. So I've got a positive line on, it's got the antigen, it's antigen positive on line 1, and I move along, and it looks here that the corresponding antibody. Someone's just commented saying the slide isn't moving for them. So far it's the same slide, it should just be that there was little crosses across the top. If it doesn't work, you might want to just quickly leave and come back, if that might help you. So yeah, so I move, I've got line 1, and I move, I would look at the IAT, can't exclude it, it's not negative, it's positive, and it's also enhanced by enzymes, and I would know, you would know working in the lab, or if you weren't sure you would double check, but anti-D is actually enhanced by enzymes. Same with number 2 and number 3, so actually you're starting to match the pattern. So you're starting to match the pattern for that. And that's when you're thinking, right, I've got that antibody. Then what you want to do is go, well, to confirm an antibody, I need 2 positive examples, 2 negative examples. I have that. I've got 2 here. I've actually got 3, but you've got to have at least 2. And then there's lots of negative ones. So at this point, you're sort of matching the pattern. One of the things you need to know, though, it's also showed here, the patient's auto control, which is something we would run on reference patients, and the patient's auto control in this instance is negative. So an auto control is just the patient's own plasma with the patient's own red cells. We've also got this positive control here, which has got a 2+ next to it, and that's just an incubation control because these panels would be performed manually. So whenever you do manual panels, you have to run an incubation control at the same time, just to show that the tests work, because if all your results were negative and you hadn't used a control, you wouldn't really know if you'd actually remembered to put the plasma in or not. That's what I would do there. And then this goes back to looking at that patient history. So we've identified that we've got an anti-D, but we don't know whether it's an allo or an auto antibody. You've got to look at the transfusion history. If they've been recently transfused, you wouldn't be able to see whether it was an auto or allo, so you'd have to call it not specified, because you could have mixed population of donor cells and patient cells. So we've got to go back to the history. That's why it's important to provide it on your form. And in this case, it's a 75-year-old male, last transfused 6 years ago. So you know that the antibody, depending on the patient's phenotype, it's not going to be not specified. It's either going to be auto or allo. And in this case, the patient's phenotype's Rhd negative. We'd know that because we'd perform an extended Rh phenotype. So this is an allo anti-D. So it's an allo antibody because it's against the patient. The patient's made an antibody to something which they are lacking. So I hope that's made sense for everybody. So now when we're looking at a pan-reactive autoantibody, so this is one, just a reminder, this is where it reacts with everything. When you're performing your screen or your panel, you need to just remember that the patient's warm IgG autoantibody will bind with all red cells, including their own cells and any IAT panel cells that you've used. And because it's an IgG antibody, it sensitizes the red cell, but when you add that bridging antibody in, that's when you're going to get your positive reaction. So it's pan-reactive and just reacts with everything. Worth bearing in mind that when you phenotype in these patients, provided that they're not recently transfused, your ABO is usually unaffected because this is an IgG autoantibody, not IgM. IgM anti-sera is usually unaffected because that's normally a direct agglutination test. But your IgG anti-sera that you use, so this is the one where you're performing an IAT phenotype, that can actually provide a false positive because the patient's red cells that you use for the phenotyping are coated with IgG. So it will give you a false positive. So you can't, if the patient has a positive DAT because of this autoantibody, you can't then use certain anti-sera with them. So Duffy's, for example. And this is what you would typically see in the lab. So if you're looking at your antibody ID there, hopefully you can just see that it's really strongly pan-reactive by IAT and it's really strongly pan-reactive by enzyme IAT. And that's because you've moved all those antigens out of the way so that the autoantibody can just get a hold of the red cells and you generally have that increased enhanced reaction. The patient's autoantibody, the patient's auto is also strongly pan-reactive. And again, that's just for incubation control because you perform a manual panel. But the question is, are there any underlying alloantibodies? And at this point, you wouldn't actually know. You couldn't look at that and go, oh, well, they've also got X, Y, and Z. So one of the things we do as well, when a patient has a positive autoantibody, you would perform a direct antiglobulin test, and a DAT or a DAT as it's known, and this shows you what's bound to the patient's red cells. So it's just a drop of the patient's red cells. Generally, you would use a cord, but if you were doing it manually, it's just a drop of the patient's red cells, and you'd add in some of the bridging antibody, and that would show you whether it's positive or not. And any interpretation of your DAT's got to include the patient history and any clinical data as well. So in autoimmune hemolytic anemia, again, it's this pan-reactive autoantibody. You'll get your positive auto control and you'll get a positive DAT, and that can be with or without complement, so on the anti-C3d. So you can see, excuse me, in this first card, you've got IgG really strongly positive, and then the second one, you've got IgG and C3d. So at this point, we've confirmed that we need to perform an alloabsorption. So you've got your pan-reactive autoantibody and your positive auto and your positive DAT. But you've got to understand your antibody interactions to see how this works. So this is where SpongeBob alloabsorption pants comes in. So how does it work? So SpongeBob is an absorption cell, and he's positive for the D antigen, so he's a D positive absorption cell. So what we have here in this plasma here, we've got anti-D, we've got anti-Duffy, and you've also got the patient's autoantibody. So there's a mixture within the patient's plasma. So what SpongeBob does, SpongeBob is papainized. So this is why he's moved to a papaya under the sea. So he's papainized. So That's because he wants to be nice and big and strong and really grab a hold of any antibodies that are there. So you patronize him to enhance the fact that he'll be able to grab hold of things really well. So SpongeBob, because he's D positive, when you mix the red cells and the plasma together, it's going to bind with its corresponding, the antibody is going to bind with its corresponding antigen. So it's going to grab a hold of the anti-D. It's also going to grab a hold of the autoantibody, because pan-reactive autoantibodies will react with all cells, including your alloabsorption cells. Like I said, he's enhanced, nice, big and strong, going to get a hold of them. When you centrifuge it, it removes the anti-D in the autoantibody because it binds to him, sticks to him. You centrifuge it, get rid of the red cells, they've taken that antibody out. But because it's patronized, it can't remove the anti-Duffy, and that's because Duffy antigens are sensitive to papain. Well, Duffy and Duffy B are sensitive to papain. So when you patronize those cells, they're effectively antigen negative, so you can't take those out. So with alloabsorption, it's about knowing what's removed and what's left behind. So it's just like a little puzzle that you sort of have to solve. And it does hurt your brain sometimes. So what we do with our absorption cells, it's the same as when you've got a panel cell, so you know the profile of those cells. So these are actual profiles of some of the cells that we've used previously in the lab. So we've got D positive ones and D negative. And you can see there that these, they don't give you a profile for the MNSs and Duffys because they're destroyed by papain, so they're effectively antigen negative. This cell here is big E negative, so this, if we were to use these absorption cells, they wouldn't be able to remove big E from the plasma. But both of these cells can remove little e from the plasma. And these are just things that you have to bear in mind when we're doing these alloabsorptions even. And it is useful to know the patient's Rh phenotype because sometimes you want to match to the patient's, when you're giving blood, you want to match sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought there. When you're giving blood to a patient, you need to match for Rh, which I will talk about in a little while. But sometimes it's useful to know if the patient has an autoantibody as well, and it just forms part of the puzzle. So this is the bit that you probably need to pay close attention to. So when we're doing absorption, how do you do it? So I've got the sequential double absorptions with patronized cells, which just sounds lovely. But essentially what it is you take your patient's plasma, you've got 2 lots of red cells, so you'd have your tubes. One would be D positive red cells and one would be D negative red cells. So we'll pass that, take a ml of the patient's plasma and put it into your D positive absorption cells, give it a good mix, take a fresh pastet, take another ml out of the patient's plasma, only this time you're going to put it into the D negative absorption cells. So you've ended up with 2 different tubes of absorption cells, one D positive, one D negative. Then you incubate it for 10 minutes at 37 degrees. If the patient did have a cold antibody, you can add a cold step, some ice in the fridge, and that'll remove the cold autoantibody as well. And then you centrifuge it, and what you end up with is D positive absorbed plasma and D negative absorbed plasma. You repeat the process, only this time, instead of using the neat plasma, you'd put the D-pos plasma into some fresh D-pos absorption cells, if that makes sense. And then you've got your D-neg absorbed plasma, you'd put that into a clean set of absorption cells. So that's where you get this double sequential absorption from. What you want to do is just remove as much of the autoantibody as you possibly can, so that you can find out what's lying underneath, if anything. So what you end up with when you do perform these tests, you've got your neat plasma, which you haven't absorbed. So this could, it contains a pan-auto because you've already done the antibody ID, but there could be underlying alloantibodies, but you don't know until you've done this process. You also have your R1R1 absorbed plasma. And again, it's this correspond, just always in the back of your mind, that the unknown antibody will bind with its corresponding antigen. So in the D-pos plasma, you've absorbed out your pan-auto, and if there's anti-D present, and anti-big C and little e, you'll have taken them out as well because this cell is antigen positive for those. and you'll also absorb out whatever else the cell's positive for. So here, this cell is JK pos. So if there was an anti-JK there, it would remove it. So this plasma could contain alloantibodies. And then in your DNEG cell, so this is a separate tube that you've done from your absorption. So this is your third tube of plasma. You've taken out your autoantibody. If it had anti-little c or anti-little e, you've also taken that out. Plus others depending on the profile. So these are just the things that this could remove. So it's taken the little c and the little e out. It could also take out anti-big K if that was there. And it could also take out anti-GKB. You would have this to hand, so you wouldn't ever expect anyone to memorise these. And again, that could contain autoantibodies. So this is the bit where you now perform an antibody ID. So once you've got your modified alloabsorbed plasma, you treat it the same way that you would your patient neat plasma. So just drop of red cells, drop of plasma, do your antibody ID, record it on the same panel sheet that you would. There's no change in the panels that you're using. So what you can see here, if you look at the grey, we've got, that's our neat plasma. So that's pan-reactive. You've got this really strong 4+ all the way down, 4+ auto control and your incubation control, because that's just good practice. But in your absorbed plasma, everything's negative in your DPOS and your DNEG absorbed plasma. So what this means, so what's happened here, in your R101 plasma, you've removed the pan-reactive autoantibody, there's nothing left behind. In your D negative plasma, you've removed the pan autoantibody and there's nothing left behind. So what this shows is you've got an pan-reactive autoantibody, but no underlying alloantibodies detected in the plasma. So, and this is how we see if there's any underlying alloantibodies. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. I'm not sure, sorry, I've just seen the comment there. I hope it's been all right for you so far. And Danny will upload that in the next few days. I'm sure I will. We could just keep an eye out on Twitter. I'm sure they'll announce it. Thank you. So now when we have these patients who have autoimmune hemolytic anemia, you've got to determine if there's any underlying alloantibodies so that you can give them the correct blood. So what you want to do is, this is why we need to know what the ABO is and the extended RH and K phenotype for these patients. And the reason that we do this is we give ABO-D an extended RH match to prevent alloimmunization. So if you've already got this autoantibody, you're quite likely to be multi-transfused, and we don't want you to make any alloantibodies. So we will match for those. It's also got to be negative, antigen negative for any alloantibodies that the patient will have. That's why it's good to have that information on the request form at the beginning, because if we can't detect it in the current sample, but you know that previously had that antibody, we can give antigen negative blood. When you perform the cross match, the units go out as suitable. So you may see this when you receive units in your lab, that instead of being compatible, they're suitable. And the reason for this is the neat cross match is positive due to the patient's autoantibody. But you could also absorb out a high incidence antibody, so we do have to sort of be careful when we're calling them, so that it's suitable for the patient. So it's good blood, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not a compatible cross match. And it can just look a little bit like this. So you have your donation with your neat plasma, and you might get quite a strong result, and that's because a strong positive result, because the patient's autoantibody reacts with any cell, will react with the donation that you're using. But you can test it against the absorbed plasma if you want, and you could see a negative result with these. And again, that's just the auto and the control, just for good practice. So now I've got another 3 antibody IDs that I'm going to go through with you. And this is just showing like how you've got to think about the pieces of the puzzle that you're doing when you perform these. So again, we've got, as with the previous, we've got our neat, we've got our absorbed plasma, and we've got our little r plasma as well. Sorry, DPOS absorbed plasma. So what you notice with this one, if you start as I did previously on the right hand side, we've got an anti-D there. So the little r plasma has got 3 pluses, which match the pattern of the anti-D, but there isn't anything in the DPOS absorbed plasma. So it's thinking about your profile of your red cells. So you know that your R1 absorption cells are D positive, therefore they would remove anti-D. So when you think about what SpongeBob's been up to, he's with the little r, it's D negative. It's taken out the pan-reactive autoantibody because the autoantibody will react with any cells. It can't remove anti-D because there's no D antigen there for any anti-D to bind to. So anti-D gets left behind. So that's what you're seeing here. Then with your R1 plasma, that's D positive. So it's removed the pan-reactive autoantibody, but it's also removed the anti-D because you've got the positive, the corresponding antigen with the corresponding antibody. So there's nothing left behind here. So what this is showing is that the patient's got a pan-reactive autoantibody and anti-D has been detected in the alloabsorbed plasma. But this goes back to that history. Is it an allo? Is it an auto? Is it not specified? So that would be if the patient was RhD negative, hadn't been recently transfused or anything, no mixed field, just clear as day RhD negative, it would be an alloantibody. If they're RhD positive, could be an autoantibody, and you can see those, particularly in these types of patients. Or would call it non-specified, say if the patient had been transfused, there was mixed field reactions and were unable to tell you what that was. So, but you would treat it as, if it's not specified, you would treat it as an alloantibody until you found out whether it was an auto, and you'd just give RhD neg blood. And you'd also match for extended RH as well, which I'll talk about in a bit. So moving on to antibody ID 3, and I hope this is making sense to everybody. So now we've done our antibody ID with both sets of plasma. So we've got our neat ones, we're R1 and we're little r. And you can see there that we've got an anti-FYE. So think about the cell profile here. So these cells are negative for Duffy antigens because they're papainized, and Duffy antigens are sensitive to papain, therefore destroyed, removed from the absorption cells. So the R1 plasma, to remove your pan-auto, it can't remove anti-Duffy A because it's effectively antigen negative, so therefore Duffy A is left behind. Little r plasma, it's D negative, it's removed the pan-auto, again, can't remove the anti-Duffy A, so it's left it behind. So knowing how your antibodies and antigens interact with one another, and the ways that you can use, like say things like using papainized cells, it's another way of just confirming the presence of an antibody. So you've done your antibody ID, but knowing that these cells can't remove the anti-Duffy A, it's just like another sort of double check. So it's like, oh yes, definitely they can't take it out, so it's confirmed it's left in both. Same as the previous slide. So we've got a pan-auto, we've found anti-Duffy A. Is it allo, auto, or non-spec? If this patient hadn't been transfused, or if the patient had been transfused, you wouldn't be able to do a phenotype because you'd have a mixture of the donor and the patient cells. So you'd get mixed field results you wouldn't be able to see. But this person, because they've got a positive autoantibody, they will have, and because they're an autoimmune hemolytic anemia patient, they will have a positive DET. So if they hadn't been transfused, you still wouldn't be able to perform your Duffy typing here because you would get that false positive from the anti-IgG. So you would probably call it non-specified and just treat it as though it was an alloantibody, and you would give FYE negative blood. Or you can perform genotypes. So we do have patients where they've made so many antibodies that you would actually do a red cell genotype on them. But that's not a test that would just perform. If there's just one single specificity antibody, you would just call it not specified and give antigen negative blood. So this is the last antibody ID now. I just don't want to overwhelm you with hundreds and hundreds of panels. So this one, you probably guessed, gets a little bit more complicated. So we've done our antibody ID in the normal way that you would with the other ones. And you're looking and you're going, oh, look, we've found an anti-M. So again, anti-M is destroyed by papain. So neither one of these cells are capable of removing anti-M from the plasma, so it would remain in both of them. This time, however, you've also detected an anti-big K, but you will notice that it was only detected in one of these. And that's again when you go back to looking at your cell profile. So just to sort of confirm, you'd say, right, I found anti-big K in me D positive absorbed plasma. So the R1R1D pos cells, that's K negative, so that can't remove it, so it's left it behind. Whereas the little r is big K positive, so it can remove it, and it has. And that's essentially what I've just said there. So with this lot of plasma and these antibodies, you remove the pan-auto, you can't remove the anti-M, so it's left behind. You can't remove the big K, so it's left behind. Then looking at your little r plasma, it's K pos. So it's removed the pan-auto, it can't remove the anti-M, it's left behind, but it can remove the anti-K. Just one thing to bear in mind, so going back to the beginning here, you've got to have that 2 positive examples and 2 negative examples to confirm the presence of an antibody. So this cell here is M pos and big K pos, so you wouldn't be able to use this as your 2 positive and 2 negative examples because it's got to be antigen neg for any other specificities that you might find, just as a little side note there. But you do, for your big K, you do have 2 positive and 2 negative examples, and the same with your anti-M. And again, just bear in mind whether the patient's been transfused or not. So in this case, if the patient hadn't been transfused, you could actually phenotype because anti-K and anti-M are both direct agglutination anti-sera, so they are IgM, so you wouldn't get that interference from your IgG antibody, so you would be able to phenotype this patient. And then because they're both detected by IAT, you would give antigen negative blood in this case. And you'll have done your phenotyping on your extended RH&K as well. So moving on to reporting results. So for those of you who are familiar with seeing the RCI reports, and these are actual reports from cases that I did when I worked in the lab. So this one's positive for IgG. We always report the data on these. And what was said here is we've got what's been detected in the patient's plasma. So these are the things that are boxed up at the top of the report. So you've got an autoantibody, pan-reactive autoantibody detected by IAT in the patient's plasma. Sorry, that's my dog barking in the background. So what the report would say is the patient's plasma contains a pan-reactive autoantibody detected by IAT. No alloantibodies were identified in the alloabsorbed plasma by the following technique. In the lab, we use BioRad IAT. We're telling them what units we've issued. So we've issued 2 units of RHD pos, big E neg, big K neg red cells, and they were supplied on XD. The reason that we've done this, and then we always provide transfusion advice at the bottom, so it's telling you if you, not that you would cross-match this, but just in general, what this patient would need. So you'd have your ABOD compatible, K compatible, big E neg red cells. Now this patient doesn't have anti-big E and they don't have anti-big K, but because they've got autoimmune haemolytic anemia and you're trying to prevent alloimmunization, you would give big K negative and big E negative because that's what this patient's phenotype is. If that makes sense. So this one is a much more complicated one, and this again is a genuine patient that we worked on when I was in RCI, and I can remember doing this patient on call because they're always on call in the middle of the night. So they've got a positive that positive for IgG. So we'll go at the top of the list here. They've got a pan-reactive autoantibody by IAT, and that was detected in the neat plasma. Also got, for good measure, an alloanti-JK, which was detected in your alloabsorbed plasma because you can't see, you would know that it's there in your neat plasma, but you can't actually see it because you have to perform the alloabsorption. So you've detected it in your alloabsorbed plasma. They've also got a big K, big E, little c, and an anti-CW. So the patient's plasma here contains a pan-reactive autoantibody, and we've just said no additional antibodies were found, so we have excluded the presence of other antibodies. And in cases like this, you may well have to run multiple panels, which is why it's always really good to have as much plasma as you possibly can, because on a patient like this, you probably wouldn't get your exclusions off just one panel. You might have to run 2 panels or multiple cells off different panels, and there's different panels that you can use in the reference lab. So we have an R101 panel, which is your little C neg, so we would have used this panel for her for this patient, just so you have enough to be able to get your exclusions. So we've also issued 2 units of A R1R1, big K neg, JKA neg, and CW neg. And the reason that I put CW neg in red there is because under normal circumstances, with a patient who might have produced an allo-anti-big C, CW, they will just have cross-match compatible by IAT. But in these cases, because the neat cross-match is suitable, so you get a positive cross-match, you can't actually exclude it. So in this case, and because this patient has so many antibodies, we also, for ease, are giving them CW neg as well. And you can see there that we've previously typed them as an R1R1. This patient happens to have little c and big E, allo-anti-big C and allo-anti-little c and big E. But if they didn't, would still give them R1R1 just to prevent further alloimmunization. So hopefully we've gone through solving the puzzle, why you've got to have that patient history. We've talked about your antibody-antigen interactions, because if you know how they work, it sort of helps you just to solve that puzzle. We've shown you how to do an antibody identification, and I really hope that made sense, but we've still got time. There's plenty of time if people want to ask questions. I've talked about blood selection and how you would decide whether to do that. And then how we report the results. So thank you for listening. And then just any questions, I'll just have a little look in the chat.
Couple of questions falling into the chat, Helen. Have you got access to chat? Can you see that with your slides up?
Yes, I can just see it on the side there.
Okay.
Let me find it, sorry. Right, so first one, how do you rule out anti-little e if both sets of absorption cells are positive? I didn't see it, but it was actually on the side that there is an R2R2 absorption cell that you can use. So with a patient who, if you wanted to exclude the presence of big E, we would use the R2R2 absorption cell. And that's why it's also handy to know that if the patient has what their extended RH phenotype is, because if it was an autoantibody, you wouldn't class it as clinically significant, so you wouldn't have to go to lengths to exclude that. But if it was an alloantibody, you would want to confirm the presence of it so that you can get them an antibody card issued, and make sure that it's not there. But it is available, but I didn't use it for purposes of this talk because it would have just been putting a third set of absorptions into there, and it might have just been a bit confusing. But it's a good question, thanks. And I can see that someone's answered that as well in the chat, so thank you, Rob. So the next one there, why are we selecting CW negative? So I've just said with this particular case, because they've got so many antibodies and the fact that the neat cross match would be, it's technically, we'll put it out as suitable, but it looks as though it's incompatible, and selection for CW neg is cross match compatible by IAT. So when you cross match in this patient, the cross match isn't compatible by IAT, so that's why I would select CW neg, but it's not something that you would just do for any patient. There we go. I hope that's been all right for everyone. I've still 10 minutes if anyone wants to ask any more questions. So slide 28. So what we're seeing there, oops, I'm just trying to go back. So this one here, we're seeing there was no additional alloantibodies detected in the alloabsorbed plasma. But when you get the RCI reports, what you have is this box appears at the top. So that tells you everything that you've found in that sample. What it would also do is if the patient has any previously reported clinically significant antibodies, so if you didn't detect them in the current sample, but they had them from a previous one, you would also report the previous one. So it's just in that box, we've listed saying this is the antibody, these are the antibodies that the patient has. And we'll see there's no additional antibodies detected. So rather than saying in the box, we found all these, and then just, it saves you from repeating yourself, really. That makes sense. Hopefully that has answered that one. emergency, I was still giving blood which is less positive than the auto control. You would have to look at that on a case-by-case basis, and it would depend what would constitute the emergency. I know this sounds like a get out of jail free, but if you had a patient that you needed to transfuse quickly before you had time to send it off to the reference lab, and you had the report, and you happen to have antigen negative blood on site, with your clinician's permission, you may be able to give that. But I wouldn't. You said it's less positive than the auto control. It's not really. You would have to look at it. Would have to be on a case by case basis, because why is it less positive than the auto control? You wouldn't just be able to give it without really doing an investigation. Definitely totally consult a haematologist about that one. Apologies, what is the easiest way to remember most of this for someone who start new in the transfusion lab? I think it's just, other people on the call may wish to jump in at this, but I know when I was a trainee, there is a lot of information and there's a lot of stuff to learn, but I think there's so many different things available. It's practice. I haven't been in the lab for over a year and a half now, and I'm thinking, can I remember doing all of these things? But it's practice and it's reading, just looking at any further education, talking to your colleagues is a perfect one to do, attending things like this, looking at any further qualifications and things you can do. A little plug for a blood bank guy. I used to love looking at his things when I was a trainee. They're absolutely brilliant educational tools, so hopefully they will help. And if anyone else wants to jump in with how they do try and remember things, just feel free. The full genotyping. Should we routinely do a full genotype indicate what potential alloantibodies could develop? You could, and I know way off in the future, I think that would be the ideal thing, is just if we genotyped all of our donors, but genotyping is a very expensive process. But in an ideal world, we could just give everybody genotype match blood, and then you wouldn't need to do any of this, just perfect match blood. But it's down to supply and cost and availability. Then you've got all your weird and wonderful things. Where do you stop? But there are certain cohorts of patients who do have full genotype, so hemoglobinopathy patients, and where they will try and give, if available, because that's one of the things, it's not always available, but they will try and give fully matched blood if possible to prevent alloimmunization. So, but definitely something for the future. Sorry, I'm just on this one. Do IRLs in the UK have triple sets R101 or 202 little r of absorption cells available? Yes, we do. If a phenotype can't be determined, e.g. due to past transfusion in the last 3 months. If when you were doing your antibody ID, if you couldn't determine what you would hope for is that you managed to get all your inclusions and your exclusions. If you couldn't, you could then possibly go and genotype that patient, because then you would know what antibodies they can and can't make. But if you can't phenotype them due to recent transfusion, what you would just do is probably most likely call it not specified, but select antigen negative blood for those patients so that they wouldn't have a transfusion reaction, because if it's not specified and they've made that antibody after a transfusion, it would be treated as clinically significant until you determined whether it was an auto antibody. So we'll just treat it as though it's an allo antibody until we can find out otherwise. Someone there doing a practical course that includes absorption, so thank you for that, Rob. Yes, they do. I forgot to plug for very own courses that we do. You can also sign up for some transfusion masterclasses as well. If you go on the Hospitals and Science website, you'll be able to get the information on there. This stuff looks difficult to me. Yes, it is. It's difficult. Is there any book or channel I should follow for learning like this for the antibody? Previous talks which have been done by various people who've done this group before, there are things available on the PBM YouTube channel. like I said, blood bank guy, even just Googling like antibody ID practice panels and things like that, there'll be plenty of things that you can come up. Depending where you're a trainee at, pop along to your blood transfusion lab. I'm sure they would be able to give you some example ones. What you can even do is contact your local NHS BT and see if they're offering any tours. There's also, if you go on the Hospital and Science website, you can do a sort of virtual blood bank tour, which might be useful, and they'll tell you more about the things that do in RCI and H&I. One's asking there, how is the proposed trial for genotype matched units for sickle patients? Unfortunately, I can't answer that one because I don't work within that area. But if you drop me or Danny an email, I'm sure we could point you in the right direction if you want to send that. Someone else is asking, sorry, that's Rob's answering, I think. NHSBT reagents provides the absorption cells to reference labs, yeah. I know some hospitals, when I worked in hospitals, when I wrote in reference, the hospitals did want to be able to do their own absorptions, but unfortunately there just isn't enough cells available, so that's why they have to be done by the reference lab. Sorry, I'm just trying to make my way. Someone's mentioned the course, that's great. Yes, you get your certificates. And I think that might be it. Yep, local lab. Thank you for everyone for jumping in there. So sorry if I've missed anything.
I think we will call the meeting to a close now. So again, thank you, Helen. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for everybody in the chat for asking questions and attending today, and hopefully see you next month.
Thanks very much for attending, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.